with this article. What's next? This I don't want to read right now. This is a literature survey. This is long. Oh, I don't think this is relevant. I might just delete it. This is not what I want. This is not interesting enough. I don't think I want the aggregation stuff. I think I've read this. Yeah, I've read this. This is aggregation. Let's read this one. In this paper, I examine the prospects for a right-based approach to the morality of pure risk imposition. In particular, I discuss a practical challenge to proponents of the thesis that we have a right against being imposed, a risk of harm. According to an influential criticism, a right against risk imposition will rule out all ordinary activities. This paper examines two strategies that rights theorists may follow in response to this paralysis problem. The first strategy introduces a threshold for when a risk imposition is a rights violation. The second strategy drops the claim that rights are absolute, maintains that all rights infringements generate compensation duties. It argues that both strategies face significant practical problems of their own. The paralysis problem seems fatal for a right against risk imposition in the absence of an adequate account of morally relevant threshold risk. Let's put the paralysis problem So this is exciting because it has two footnotes, both labeled 1. Do you have a natural right that I not read crime and punishment? If this would cause a smallish increase in the probability that I might one day rob and bludgeon you? Railton, 1985. No page number citation. Cool. In this paper, I examined the prospects for a right-based approach to morality of... Yeah, I'm done with Animal Collective. How many more? This is 8 minutes left on the album. Can't do it. Good enough. Okay, in this position, I examine the prospects for a rights-based approach to the morality of peer Risk-Imposition. In particular, I'll discuss a practical challenge to the proponents of right-based ethics of Risk-Imposition. According to Holm and Wolf, give me a sec. Give me a sec. Almost done. Okay, that's cool. All right. Album art. But it's not lined up. I want it. Okay, now chat. Okay. Sorry. I just I wanted to do that. Let's put. Okay. Okay. Back to philosophy. In this paper, I examined the prospects for a right-based approach to morality per Risk-Imposition. In particular, I'll discuss a practical challenge that promotes a right-based ethics of Risk-Imposition. According to Hein, Yam, and Wolf, it seems impossible to argue that there's an absolute right not to be subject to any risk in which one is not consented. For this would seem to rule out virtually all action. Okay, so this Hein, Helm, and Wolf thing is... I will eventually have to read it. I will follow Holm and Wolf is referring to this as the paralysis problem. They characterize the paralysis problem as a central philosophical problem about the permissibility of risk imposition. The observation can, I think, be backed up by pointing out that the problem is the stable of discussions of risk imposition during the last 4 decades. Thus, Charles Fried raised the worry about paralysis. It's noted by Nozick in his discussion of risk. It's been discussed continually in the literature on permissible risk imposition since then. Oh, too much. I haven't read some of this. While the problem concerns the practical consequences of the practical consequences of the risk thesis, the claim that individuals have a right against risk imposition is generally claimed to show that the risk thesis is contradictory and incoherent, reduced to absurdity, and should be rejected as false. In short, it seems crucial for the rights-based account of the morality of risk imposition to respond to the paralysis problem. So let's In short, it seems crucial for a rights-based account of the morality of risk imposition to respond to the paralysis problem. This paper makes several distinctive contributions to the discussion of the rights theoretical approach to morality and risk. First, it structures the central arguments of the debate in terms of 2 strategies that rights theorists may follow in response to the paralysis problem. The first strategy to be considered is to weaken the claim that individuals have a right against risk imposition by introducing a threshold for when a risk imposition is a rights violation. The second strategy to be examined holds on to a strong claim against risk imposition and makes adjustments elsewhere in the rights theoretical framework. Okay, and then a second thing. Second, thinking in terms of these 2 strategies provides an excellent basis for discussing the important defense of the risk thesis in the face of the problem of paralysis presented in McCarthy. Finally, the paper presents 2 original arguments against McCarthy's theory, and thus moves the debate about the morality of risk forward by showing that the most recent and so far undisputed in-depth defense of the risk thesis does not provide an adequate response to the problem of paralysis. Finally, the paper connects the philosophical discussion of morality as risk imposition to issues concerning standard practice and negligence law. Cool. Let's see who cites this. Cited by 19, not that much. Sorry, I'm downloading a paper right now by Faye Song called Rights Against High-Level Risk Impositions. Okay, back to reading. Before I delve into the problem of paralysis, I should note there's another related problem that arises in connection with the risk thesis, which I will not discuss in this paper. What might be called the proliferation problem concerns the fact that the risk thesis seems to entail a burgeoning of trivial rights violations, and that this may thought to diminish our respect for rights in general. This problem is also a serious one, while full assessment of the right against risk imposition will also include a discussion of the proliferation problem. I'll leave it aside as a topic on another paper. Here I focus on the problem of paralysis. Thompson rejects the risk thesis due to the proliferation problem. Zimmerman and McCarthy don't think they do not think proliferation is an adequate reason for rejecting the risk thesis. The plan of the paper is this. Section 2I introduces the notion of a pure risk imposition, the risk thesis, and the problem of paralysis. In Section 3, I assess the strategy of circumscribing the risk thesis by introducing a threshold risk. And then in Section 4 and 5, I consider the strategy of maintaining the undiluted version of the risk thesis. I conclude that the paralysis problem presents a formidable obstacle for the proponents of risk thesis, though I suggest that the threshold account may be able to handle the paralysis problem if the relevant threshold can be determined. Ordinary activities of everyday life impose risk of harm on other people, and thus it seems pertinent to consider how moral theories approach the question of when it is permissible for an individual to impose a pure risk of harm on another individual. Thompson introduces the notion of a pure risk of imposition, presenting the following case. Suppose A played Russian roulette on B. B has no ground for complaint against A, even if B was caused no. B has ground for complaint against A, even if B was caused no harm, and even if B was unaware of what happened, so that he was caused no fear or discomfort. The ground for complaint lies in the fact that A imposed a risk of death on B. In this case, A imposed a pure risk of harm on B because no actual harm results from the risk imposing action. Thus, B might be or become aware of pure risk imposition. Pure risk impositions with the risk imposed individual never becomes aware may be called super pure risk impositions. However, I focus on pure risk impositions. Rights theories arguably come up short when challenged to account for the distinction between permissible and impermissible pure risk imposing actions. For rights theorists to be able to say that some pure risk imposing actions are impermissible, they must put forward the following thesis, the risk thesis. We have a right that other people not impose risks of harm on us. However, if the risk thesis is true, then arguably most of the ordinary activity that people engage in will turn out to be impermissible. Toasting bread, making coffee, okay, sorry. So the reason I'm reading all this stuff is I'm working on a paper about driving, and so whenever people talk about like driving and risk imposition, I want to start moving it into my notes for that paper. So toasting bread, making coffee, and driving to work are activities that impose pure risk on other people. If doing so constitutes infringement, then people are not permitted to do any of these things. Page numbers here, do I? Yeah, that's the risk. Thesis generates the paralysis problem. When to deal with the paralysis problem may opt to one of two possible strategies. One strategy is to make room for permissible risk imposition by somehow circumscribing the right against risk imposition. The strategy will aim at enabling rights theorists to permit ordinary risk impositions by showing that they do not qualify as rights infringements. An alternative strategy is to maintain that all risk impositions are rights infringements and account for when such rights infringements are permissible. In other words, the first strategy aims to show that ordinary risk impositions are not right infringements and thus permissible. The second aims to show that while all risk impositions are rights infringements, some of them are permissible. We'll discuss these strategies in turn. Before I move on, a brief comment on the relation between risk imposition and harm. Legal philosophers have proposed that the right against risk imposition can be grounded in the fact that risk imposition are a kind of harm. So this guy cites Oberdiak, which again makes it look like Maheshwari is correct to say that the autonomy account of the wrongness of risk imposition. Oh no, because this wasn't about wrong. This wasn't about, yeah, it was about harm. Never mind. Oberdiak produces an important argument for the conclusion that the moral significance of risking resides in the fact that it results in a non-material negative effect. Oh no, it's a harm. More precisely, a negative to more precisely, a setback to people's interest in autonomy, therefore constitutes an actual harm. Whatever. However, in this paper, I followed Thompson and McCarthy and assumed that risk-imposition is not itself a harm. Okay. The threshold risk thesis and the indifference thesis. Taken at face value, the risk thesis seems to lead to paralysis. In order to avoid paralysis, risk theorists may try to weaken the risk thesis by circumscribing the risky actions that it targets. One way to do so is suggest that below some threshold, the risk is imposition doesn't amount to a rights infringement. However, as the risk imposed is sufficiently great, it will infringe the right against risk imposition, thus being impermissible. This line of argument can be characterized as suggesting a modified version of the risk thesis. Threshold risk thesis. We have a right that other people not impose risk of power above threshold R. Arguably, the paralysis problem can be avoided if we accept the threshold risk thesis. If accepted, the thesis ensures that people are prohibited from imposing unacceptably high risks on others, but are permitted to perform ordinary risk-imposing actions such as toasting bread and driving cars. The threshold grants people a reasonable degree of freedom of autonomy and restricts the level of risk that may permissibly be imposed upon them. Proponents of the threshold risk thesis also accept the following thesis and indifference thesis. If doing F has the probability P of causing outcome E and doing F prime has the possibility of F star has a probability P of causing outcome E, then there would be no grounds for permitting doing F and not permitting doing F star, reasoning exclusively on the basis of risk magnitude. For instance, if toasting bread and playing Russian roulette on my neighbor imposes the same probability of killing him, there would be no reason to prohibit one and allow the other, reasoning in terms of risk magnitude only, while the indifference thesis is plausible. I think there are strong objections to the threshold risk thesis based on moral features of risk imposition. Feels like a response to a note if I've ever seen one, because we just jump immediately from the indifference thesis to whatever this guy was writing before somebody told him to put that in. Let's just call this threshold risk thesis. Let's put the paralysis problem under the wrongness of risk imposition. I wonder who defends this, if anybody. It'd be good to put that in the article. That's all right. I'll find out. An immediate worry about the threshold risk thesis is that proponents must tell a story about how the threshold is to be fixed, and there's no straightforward and uncontroversial answer to this question. However, for the purposes of the paper, I'll grant proponents of the threshold risk thesis, the threshold R, and focus on what I take to be a deeper worry, namely there are some risky actions which are equal in terms of risk magnitude, and still our moral intuition suggests differentiating between them by means of some normative considerations of the risk magnitude. In connection with this sort of problem, Nozick proposes to distinguish between productive and non-productive actions, and Railton discusses the merits of distinguishing between intentional and non-intentional actions. To illustrate the claim, consider the following two cases. Toast. I'm turning on my toaster. I pose a risk of people in my building below threshold R, below R Russian roulette. Playing a game of Russian roulette with you with an n number of chamber revolver while you were asleep, imposing a risk on you below threshold R. I am interested in where this is going, but I'm going to use the restroom, so I'll be right back. In both these cases, the risk imposed is below the threshold. Hence, we should give the same moral evaluation in the two cases unless some other feature of them justifies different moral assessments. Still, the objection goes playing Russian roulette is impermissible even if the risk imposed is below the threshold. In other words, it's not the side of the risk that matters, but the risk imposition such, so how can proponents of the threshold risk thesis maintain that toast is a case of permissible risk imposition and below R Russian roulette is not given, and that the risk imposed in the two cases is below R? Nozick's reply to this problem is to suggest two features of Russian roulette that explain why it's prohibited despite imposing a below threshold risk. Russian roulette is not socially valuable activity, not productive. Russian roulette is not an ordinary and important feature of people's lives. Okay, so this is... I might just do you in. Ain't it a sin? Okay, in response to this problem, advocates of the threshold risk thesis may try to justify treating the two cases differently by appealing the distinction between intending and merely foreseeing a risk imposition. When toasting bread, I do not intend to impose a risk on other people. It's merely a foreseen side effect of my toasting effects. On the other hand, when playing Russian below our Russian roulette on my sleeping neighbor, I intend to impose the risk of death on her. I think there's good reason to reject the appeal to intention, assuming that we think it's intrinsically wrong to kill an innocent person. Our intention is relevant for the wrongness of this action. It seems not for the following reason. In case we consider killing an innocent to be intrinsically wrong, adding that the action was done intentionally does not turn a morally neutral act into an intrinsically wrong act. Rather, it's the other way around. It's wrong intentionally to kill an innocent because it's wrong to kill an innocent. Full stop. This line of argument can be found in Railton. Thus, if it's the rights infringement and thus morally wrong to intentionally impose a risk of harm on someone, that's not because the fact that the risk imposition is intended, but because the fact that it was intended is a rights infringement, and so the appeal to intention should be rejected. See Scanlon for an important discussion of the relevance of intention for the moral assessment of an action. However, if intentions don't make a difference to the permissibility of action, then rights theorists proposing the threshold risk thesis cannot prohibit below our Russian roulette cases by reference to the fact that the agent intends to impose harm below our Russian roulette, and toasting bread must receive the same moral evaluation relative to the size of risk they impose. However, okay, I'm cold. I'm trying to think if I should put this whole dialectic into Hypernomicon. I'm leaning towards yes. Let's do it. What does he call it? Okay, however, I think proponents of the threshold risk thesis may provide an adequate account of the moral difference between toast and below our Russian roulette. Consider the uncontroversial case of toasting bread. In ordinary circumstances, the risk imposition resulting from toasting bread is a forcing side effect of the action, not an aim. However, consider the person who toasts bread as a means to impose a small risk of harm on his neighbor. In this case, we do not conclude that toasting bread is a wrongful action. Rather, the moral wrongfulness resides in the reasons that the agent has for performing the action. In other words, in some cases, an agent may be blameworthy for performing an otherwise permissible risk-imposing action due to the agent's reasons for acting. We now see that the distinction between blameworthy and non-blameworthy toasting can be generalized as distinction between blameworthy and non-blameworthy risk imposition, assuming that actions resulting in risk imposition below R are not rights infringements intent not morally impermissible, then below R Russian roulette will not be wrong due to the risk imposed by the act. What's morally wrong about it is that the game involves a blameworthy motivation for performing a risk imposing action. Some, I think, proponents of the threshold risk thesis can respond to the below R Russian roulette case by pointing out that it is a case of blameworthy risk imposition, not a case where the risk imposition itself is impermissible. Okay. What I don't understand is how reasons are different from intentions. Okay, whatever. Not very important, I think. Still, there's another problematic feature of the threshold risk thesis which comes out from considering the more true-to-life case suggested by McCurley. Toxic waste. In a factory that as a byproduct produces toxic waste, I have two options how to dispose of the toxic waste. One option is to bury it underground, therefore imposing a risk on my neighbor that the toxic waste will seep into his property and cause harm. The risk is above R, and thus this option constitutes an infringement of my neighbor's right against risk imposition. The second option is to dump the toxic waste in a river bordering on my property. The option imposes a risk of harm on all the people living along the river. However, the risk imposed of each is well below R, and hence no rights are infringed by this option. In general, the threshold risk thesis entails that a single individual is permitted to perform actions that impose a below threshold risk on other individuals, even the action results in a close to 1 probability that someone will suffer severe harm. Thus, if the toxic waste dumped in the river affects 1 million people, impose it to 1 million risk of death to each. It will not infringe any individual's right, and hence will be permitted on the threshold risk thesis. Several authors criticize the threshold risk thesis for telling that no rights are infringed when the risk is spread out thinly on many individuals. Rights theorists may try to meet this criterion either by showing that dumping the waste in the river does infringe a right and therefore avoid the allegedly repugnant conclusion, or they may argue that the fact that no rights are infringed in this case is not such a repugnant conclusion after all. One way to argue that dumping the waste in the river does involve a rights infringement is to point out that because someone will actually be harmed, there's someone whose right is being infringed when dumping the waste in the river. However, this response does not get to the problem. The problem concerns infringement of the right not to be imposed a risk of harm, not the right to be imposed a harm. Correct. This is what Mahaswari was failing to understand in her article. In other words, the relevant perspective is ex ante, not as post, and ex ante there's no impermissible risk imposition on anyone. So I guess the Bastion article is relevant to what Maheshwari was missing. Importantly, if we interpret risk imposition along the lines of a Burdick, there will be a right violation ex ante in this case. Okay. What's the prospect of maintaining that it's not repugnant to conclude that no rights are infringed when spreading the risk thinly over many people? First of all, central motivation for rights theorists is that they are non-consequentialist. Sometimes the morally right thing to do is something that does not maximize the overall good. It's thus a core feature of rights theorists that it's more important not to infringe the rights of an identified individual than to ensure that nobody gets harmed. In the case at hand, the expected harm results from the second option. It's higher than the expected harm resulting from the first, so if we're concerned with consequentialists, then we should pick the first option. However, the important driving force behind rights theories is that we ought not to infringe people's rights, even when it may produce more good overall. In short, given its non-consequentialist motivation, it doesn't seem like a good argument against the rights theory that entails we should opt for the solution that is large expected harm. This is exactly what the theory is meant to permit. In conclusion, if we grant a threshold, I do not think the objections I have considered are conclusive. The objection that the threshold risk thesis can't account for the wrongness of below or irrational that is not convincing once we consider an independent distinction between the moral evaluation of an action and the reasons or motives for performing the action. See, he says motives. Surely a motive is an intention. And with regard to the toxic waste case, the objection that the option of spreading the risk thinly should not make dumping waste permissible is, I think, a controversial implication of the threshold risk thesis. Still, it's not clear that constitutes a non-question begging objection to the rights theorists, since they don't expect consequentialist good of reasoning. In short, I submit the threshold risk thesis has the tools for providing an adequate response to the objections considered in this section. Still, as already noted, the threshold risk thesis does face a significant practical challenge in determining a risk threshold. Okay. Let's put this in Hypernomicon. I'm not sure it really matters, but Okie dokie. I think it's a pretty good argument. If anybody is actually watching in chat and you have views on whether or not it's a good argument, let me know. I've already stacked the deck because I told you I think it's all right, but people may disagree. Okay, cool. An alternative to the strategy of weakening the risk thesis by introducing a threshold is to embrace it, thereby making all risk impositions rights and infringements, and then show that such infringements are permissible when certain conditions are met. A standard way to do so is to appeal to the notion of consent. If a person consents to the risk imposition from some activity, then it's permissible to perform that activity, despite the fact that it infringes a person's right. Thus, if the neighbor to my factory explicitly consents to being opposed to the risk that comes from burying the toxic waste underground beforehand, I'm permitted to do it. One might debate. Water went down the wrong way. One might debate when consent to a rights infringement is legitimate and whether some consented to infringement should nevertheless be prohibited. However, I think that most pressing issue arising from the appeal of consent is that the scope of individuals on which ordinary activities impose a risk make it practically infeasible to seek explicit consent from all whose right against risk imposition is infringed. In other words, there's a practical problem for appealing to the notion of consent, namely that it's simply not always practically possible to determine who to ask for consent and to seek out those who are affected by risk imposing action. For example, our actions also impose risk on future individuals for whom it's obviously impossible to acquire explicit consent. In addition to this practical impasse, it also seems to be conceptually impossible to consent to a risk imposition. Risk imposition is, by definition, non-consensual. Is that true? Thus, in those cases where practical consent is actually obtained, we no longer have a case of risk imposition. Rather, such cases are one in which the agent decides to take a risk. For those rights theorists taking the consent line in response to the paralysis problem, it will be tempting to propose schemes of ex post compensation. This would amount to a form of hypothetical consent, which is assumed that those whose right against risk imposition has been infringed would have agreed to a risky activity ex ante if offered certain benefits. There will be two subgroups of individuals whose rights are infringed. One group will include all and only those individuals who are actually harmed by the risky activity. The other group will include all and only those risk-imposed individuals who are not caused any actual harm from the risky activity. With respect to the first group, compensation should be such that the victim has been indifferent ex ante when given the choice between suffering the actual harm and getting compensation and not suffering the actual harm. With respect to the second group, the compensation must be a benefit that would ex ante make the person indifferent to the option of risk imposition plus benefit and not being exposed to the risk at all. There are, of course, limits to compensation for risk impositions. If you die, I cannot compensate you. I will leave this problem aside and merely note that this shows that compensation is not clearly a way of avoiding tough decisions on risky activities. Still, there are both practical and theoretical problems with the appeal of hypothetical consent. From a practical perspective, determining who should get what, and in particular which future individual should get what, because of the risk imposed on them by what I do today, seems practically impossible. In other words, simply requiring risk imposers to calculate how much they should provide in compensation to those they put at risk, according to their hypothetical consent, will be such an enormous task that would lead to the paralysis problem. From a theoretical perspective, hypothetical consent does not cohere well with anti-paternalistic aspects of rights theories. It's in the tradition from Locke. Rights theories emphasize the importance of letting people decide for themselves instead of saying that had you been asked beforehand and where you fully rational and well-informed, then you would have consented to a risky activity. Finally, it's worth noting that hypothetical consent is not accepted in relation to property rights. Rights theorists do not generally think that it's permissible to steal and appeal to hypothetical consent and compensation. I'm not permitted to steal your money to invest them and then give you money back with interest just because you would have hypothetically consented to this arrangement. Thus, the appeal to consent, whether explicit or hypothetical, does not seem to enable the rights theorists to maintain the risk thesis and avoid the paralysis problem. I don't know about all of that, but whatever. Not super important. Notably, proponents of the threshold risk thesis also introduce a consideration that's not traditionally accepted with respect to property rights. It's not as if what I steal must be above the threshold value in order for my theft to be a right infringement. Stealing a hairpin is as impermissible as stealing a car. I don't even know about that, but okay. Summing up, I submit the proponents of the risk thesis who try to make room for permissible risk impositions by appealing to the notion of hypothetical consent face a number of very strong objections. Thus, I conclude the strategy for dealing with the paralysis thesis problem does not seem very promising. Let's put it into Hypernomicon. No Iggy Pop. No Sufjan Stevens. Music is too compelling to listen to right now. Yeah, let's do Thundercat. Okay. Ba, 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 ba. The same argument twice. Um, I don't understand how the property rights thing is super relevant because some risks are not. Where was this safety pin thing? Yeah, okay, that's a separate thing. Okay, cool. So far, I've assumed that all rights infringements are impermissible, which is to say I've assumed that rights are absolute. However, McCarthy defends the risk thesis in part by arguing that rights are not absolute. Rights may permissibly be infringed when the good gained by infringement sufficiently outweighs the harm incurred by infringing the rights. In this section, I first defend McCarthy's case against absolutism, then I take out McCarthy's account of compensation. Like the threshold risk thesis, all ordinary risk impositions will be rights infringements and thus generate compensation duties. I argue that McCarthy's natural lottery rule for governing compensation claims should be rejected. I conclude that McCarthy's proposal leads to a form of paralysis. In order to establish his argument against absolutism, McCarthy presents the following case: stealing drugs. Suppose you're away on vacation. I suddenly unexpectedly need a small amount of the drug. You have plenty of to save my life. It's quite clearly permissible for me to take the amount of drug. Despite your having a right that I not take it, you own it, but we cannot maintain that your right that I not take it is absolute. Absolute is to recognize that it's clearly permissible to steal in this case. Irrelevant email. Your absolute is to recognize it's clearly permissible to steal in this case. It's not at all clear to me that strictly non-consequentialist rights theory should accept this case of one in which stealing is clearly permissible. However, I will not take issue with McCarthy's argument against the absolutism in this paper. May try to recognize the permissibility of my stealing the drug may make him one of two replies. They can specify the right you have against my stealing is a right that I don't impermissibly steal the drug, or they can point out that you only have a right against my stealing the drug and you only have a right against my stealing the drug in certain circumstances. That is to say, in some circumstances, the right against my stealing the drug is absent. The first reply simply amounts to saying that I'm permitted to take the drug because I'm permitted to take it. Yeah. Your possession of ownership right in the drug doesn't figure in the explanation of why it's permissible for me to steal it. The second reply is not convincing either. In the case at hand, we would think I'm under a duty to compensate you for the theft. However, the duty to compensate you arises from the fact that you had a right against my stealing the drug. Hence, the circumstances in which there is no right infringement, which contradicts the second reply. Yeah. This case is one in which there's a permissible rights infringement. Hence, rights are not absolute. It's sometimes permissible to infringe them. The next question is under what conditions rights infringements are permissible. The most obvious reason to permit rights infringements, such as the one stealing drugs, is presumably that something good comes out of it. More specifically, it seems that the good result from the rights infringement is sufficiently large to justify the trade-off suffered by the individual, justify the burden suffered by the individual who tries to infringe. McCarthy called this the trade-off idea. The trade-off idea, rights infringement is permissible if the good that would come of the infringement sufficiently outweighs the burden of the infringement to the bearer of the right. It's notable that the trade-off idea is not limited to the claim that the good produced by the rights infringement sufficiently outweighs the burden. Insofar as the trade-off is one presented by Thompson, it involves a distribution requirement according to which the good is not an aggregation of minor goods to many distinct individuals. The sufficient large good must be obtained by a single individual. The sufficiently large good outweigh the burden of the bearer of the right only if there's at least one person whose benefit is sufficiently greater than the burden. How should we determine the good resulting from a rights infringement sufficiently outweighs the burden imposed on the individual whose rights against him risk imposition is being infringed? McCarthy proposes a sliding threshold account of when a good is sufficiently large. The burden of being imposed the risk is the product of the size of the possible harm and the possibility of the results from the risky action. To illustrate, assume that we have a unit by which we measure the size of the harm, such as being blinded or killed. Being blinded amounts to 100 units. Then imposing a 0.1 risk of blinding Abby will impose a burden of 10 units on her. Moreover, Abby's burden from being imposed, this risk of being blinded will be equivalent to Bob's burden when imposed a 0.01 harm of 1,000 units and equivalent to imposing a risk of 1 of certain on Charlie that he suffers a harm of 10. We can now explicate the idea that there's a sliding threshold of how much good must we expect to result in order for a risk imposition to be permissible. The relation of the notion to a sliding threshold, I think, is worth noting that Kagan thinks the appeal of sliding threshold is the only solution to the paralysis problem of the rights theorists. Furthermore, Kagan points out that sliding threshold may be determined in a number of ways. For example, in contrast with McCarthy's, Kagan suggests that an act with twice the risk of any given harm is a second act need not have exactly twice as high a threshold, and the idea of a sliding threshold does not imply that acts with the identical expected harm, size of harm times probability of inflicting that harm must have identical thresholds. That is, an act with a higher risk of harm of inflicting a small harm need not have a low threshold, even though the expected harm is the same as for some other act with a small risk of inflicting a great harm, which does have a low threshold. Blah, 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 blah. The expected benefit of the rights infringement must sufficiently outweigh the expected burden where those values are understood in terms of the expected utility. Combining the rights threshold with the trade-off idea, McCarthy concludes the problem can be avoided by allowing the sliding scale the good does need to make rights infringements permissible, with in particular relatively little good needs to make permissible infringements, which hardly make the bearer of the right any worse off at all. We can account for our understanding of the permissibility of a very wide range of risk positions. In addition to the risk thesis and the trade-off idea, McCarthy accepts the compensation idea. Other things being equal, if one person infringes the right of another, then very roughly the infringer is under duty to compensate the bearer of the right. Other things are not equal if the risk imposer is ignorant. In that case, it's not clear that the duty to compensate arises, so the focus here will be on cases where the risk imposer knows about the risk being imposed. If we accept the compensation idea in the risk thesis, then all risk impositions come with a duty to compensate. To some, this conclusion appears problematic. Ordinarily, duties to compensate arise when an individual is actually harmed, not when the individual is merely imposed a risk of harm. Thompson rejects the risk thesis because compensation duties do not seem to be generated by pure risk impositions. McCarthy argues that there are cases in which compensation duties are very closely linked to pure risk impositions. So the challenge to the risk thesis presented by the compensation is that the risk infringements are sufficient for there being compensation duties, but not all risk impositions result in compensation duties. Hence, in opposition to the risk thesis, not all risk impositions can be rights infringements. Call this the compensation problem. McCarthy approaches the compensation problem by taking a closer look at what it would be to compensate for a risk imposition, what sort of compensation scheme should proponent of the risk thesis propose. McCarthy suggests there are two compensation rules to choose between. This is getting complicated. Direct payment rule. If an agent imposes a risk of harm on another, then he or she is under a duty to compensate the risk bearer by making a direct payment. Natural lottery rule. If an agent imposes a risk on others, then he or she is under a duty to pay the risk bearer compensation for the harm if the risk bearer suffers the harm as a result of bearing the risk and nothing otherwise. Whether we apply one or the other rule to agents who impose risks on others, the following is the case. If the agent is guaranteed to comply with whatever duties arise from that rule, then the risk bearer is fully compensated. If the agent is guaranteed to comply with whatever duties arise from that rule, then the risk bearer is fully compensated for bearing the risk. Okay. More specifically, proponents of the risk thesis can maintain that the thesis is consistent with the compensation idea by pointing out that for any agent who imposes a risk on others, is the case that the agent is subject to a rule such that if the agent complies with the rule, then the risk bearers are guaranteed to be fully compensated for the risk imposition. Of course, that there is no guarantee that agents always comply with the rule, but that's a different matter. Note that also that the sort of case I discuss here is not the sort of case where the risk imposed would be hypothetically consented to by the person on which the risk is imposed. That would amount to an agent accepting risk plus compensation package or taking the risk. Still, an important assumption of the risk of this reply is that the expected harm of the risk imposing action that determines the size of the compensation. However, it will be very difficult, if not impossible, always to compensate the expected risk. To calculate the expected risk of harm imposing actions was necessary for applying the direct payment rule. Hence, McCarthy suggests that there's a reason to determine compensation for a risk imposition only if the actual harm results, which is what the natural lottery rule suggests. With respect to the natural lottery rule, one problematic implication may be thought to be that it makes the actual consequences of the risky action irrelevant for the size of the compensation. However, I do not think this is a strong objection to the natural lottery rule. The compensation is for a risk imposition. The next calculation of the burden to be compensated is appropriate. However, I think there's another aspect of the natural lottery rule that poses a significant problem for accepting the rule. According to the natural lottery rule, cases of pure risk impositions are rights infringements generating a duty to compensate. However, when the risky actions do not result in actual harm, the risk imposer doesn't have to actually pay any compensation. This scheme is attractive because it avoids having to calculate compensation for all cases of pure risk impositions. Only a small subset of all risk impositions will actually cause harm. However, if for some reason the natural lottery rule must be rejected, then accepting a risk thesis entails a version of the paralysis problem because the only alternative compensation rule, direct payment rule, is practically impossible to apply. A first point to note with respect to the natural lottery rule is that, in contrast with the direct payment rule, it entails that compensation is only to be paid in cases where the actual harm occurs. This reveals a morally relevant discrepancy between the two rules. What makes the direct payment rule seem justified, even if impractical, is that the compensation is owed when rights are infringed without consent. The natural lottery rule, if accepted, does not honor this idea, since it entails that individuals whose rights against Risk-Imposition is violated do not have a claim to receive compensation, even if some individual is under a duty to compensate them. Note that the natural lottery rule is not the idea that we pool together the compensation owed for risk impositions or to pay those who actually get harmed compensation for being harmed. The idea is that not all risk imposers pay a risk premium for the risk that they impose, which is not that all risk imposers pay a risk premium for the risk they impose, which is then distributed to those who suffer actual harm. Those being harmed only get compensated as calculated ex ante, i.e., the size of the compensation is what would have made them prospectively as well off had they not been imposed the risk. This is an important consequence, which reflects a morally really important discrepancy between the natural lottery rule and the direct payment rule. First, assuming that not all risk impositions result in actual harm, the total amount of compensation paid on the basis of the natural lottery rule will be lower than the total amount that would be paid on the direct payment rule. In other words, the amount owed on the basis of the compensation duties incurred will not equal the amount paid out in compensation on the basis of the natural lottery rule. Natural lottery rule can thus be said to entail a compensation deficit. Insofar as compensation is a matter of making up for a moral wrong, even when this wrong is permissible, the natural lottery rule entails a moral deficit compared to the direct payment rule. Hence, if one thinks the direct payment rule is a theoretically adequate, even if impractical way of determining compensation claims, then one has good theoretical reason to reject the natural lottery rule is inadequate. Metaphorically speaking, the difference between the two rules may be said to be like the difference between paying directly for participating in the lottery and only wanting to pay for the lottery ticket if one wins. McCarthy might reply that the natural lottery rule should be accepted on pragmatic grounds. Clearly, the direct payment rule would not be realizable. We should work with the best alternative, which is the natural lottery rule. However, defending the natural lottery rule on pragmatic grounds is also problematic. First, it's worth noting that McCarthy does not include the compensation has to be practically feasible as an additional qualification to be captured under the other things being equal clause in his statement of the compensation idea. Unlike ignorance, the practical infeasibility of honoring the compensation duty does not cancel or efface it. Compensation duties linger despite the fact that they cannot be met. So coming up with an alternative to the direct payment rule amounts to proposing a criterion for determining which lingering compensation duties must be settled. The natural lottery rule proposes such a criterion when there is an actual harm as a result of risk imposition. However, at no point does McCarthy give a justification for why actual harm should serve as a criterion for settling compensation claims. As a matter of fact, it seems wholly arbitrary to suggest that actual harms determine when compensation for a risk imposition should be settled, unless one thinks that the actual harm is what matters about risk impositions. Why not propose the following rule as the basis for identifying a practically feasible subset of risk impositions that require determination of compensation? Natural redhead rule: if the agent imposes a risk of harm on others, then he or she is under a duty to pay the risk bearer compensation for the harm. If the risk bearer is a natural redhead and nothing otherwise. Presumably, the natural redhead rule is not practically impossible to apply. It is, however, completely arbitrary from the moral point of view and thus inadequate as a rule for determining compensation. In other words, a pragmatic grounding of the rule for when compensation claims should be settled should be justified by more than its practical feasibility, but McCarthy has not provided such justification for the natural lottery rule. Perhaps a better rule would be one according to which we should simply settle as many compensations as practically possible, but then some non-arbitrary rule for which compensation claims to determine must be identified. Note that in this case, we're discussing a rule for determining compensation claims. Hence, we cannot suggest that the ones to be determined should be the ones where a large compensation is owed, since we will not know which ones are large before we embark on the project of determining compensation claims. In short, McCarthy has not provided pragmatic justification of the natural lottery rule. My criticism of McCarthy relates to an interesting discussion concerning compensation, or concerning the compatibility of McCarthy's theory with negligence law, where the norm is that one has a duty, the norm is that one has to cause harm in order to be under a duty to compensate. By proposing the natural lottery rule, McCarthy seems to make his account fit this practice better. Thus, Handfield and Pisciota writes that implementing the natural lottery rule is superficially identical to the standard practice of negligence law. However, making his account compatible with practice based on actual harm as the basis of compensation duties does not justify selecting actual harm as the defining feature of the subset of risk imposition for which compensation will be determined. As a matter of fact, my criticism McCarthy may be taken to point out that if we accept the risk thesis of compensation idea, then the standard practice of negligence law based on actual harm ought to be revised. See also Perry 2009 for further discussion of the relationship between McCarthy's view and negligence law. Perry takes McCarthy's account to be in tension with existing practices. Interesting. In conclusion, I submit there are two good reasons to reject the natural lottery rule. First, it differs significantly from the direct payment rule in that it entails a compensation deficit. Second, no justification has been put forward for why this rule should be chosen as the best pragmatic solution to the practical problem of determining compensation claims. In particular, there may be compensation claims that are practically feasible and entails a smaller compensation deficit than there might be smaller compensation deficit than the natural lottery rule. Hence, unless McCarthy produces another alternative to the direct payment rule that doesn't entail a compensation deficit and is not arbitrary, he is left with the direct payment rule. However, the direct payment rule is practically impossible to apply. As McCarthy convincingly argued, then the risk thesis must appeal to the rule in order to accommodate the compensation idea. Then the risk thesis entails what amounts to paralysis. I thus submit McCarthy has not provided an adequate defense to the risk thesis vis-a-vis the paralysis problem. This is not to say there may not be other solutions to the compensation problem, all I've shown. Yeah. Okay, we're not putting all that in Hypernomicon. It seems all obviously correct. We're just putting a stub for McCarthy, basically. Yeah, so we're not really going to bother going into detail. I think that's all just correct. I've investigated the merits of two strategies that rights theorists may propose for dealing with the paralysis problem. The first strategy is to try and circumscribe the right imposing activities that qualify as rights infringements by qualifying the rights thesis with the threshold. I've argued that while the threshold rights thesis can be defended against the objections considered, it's not vindicated until an adequate account of how to determine the morally relevant threshold is presented. The alternative strategy is to maintain the risk thesis. I've considered one of the most detailed defense of the risk thesis due to McCarthy and found that McCarthy's account of the possibility of combining the risk thesis with compensation ideas faces strong objections. If we accept the risk thesis and the claim that all rights violations generate compensation duties, then the only justified compensation rule is the direct payment rule. However, this will, in line with McCarthy's own reasoning, resurrect the paralysis problem because it's practically impossible to calculate and pay compensation for every risk imposing action we perform in everyday life. In short, unless the risk threshold can be determined, the paralysis problem is fatal to the risk thesis. Where was this published? Ethical Theory and Moral Practice. Cool. Done.